we've got everybody here now. So welcome you all to our monthly lecture series, these stages for the Rabbinic Women's Historical Society. Thank you all for making your way out. We expect we'll have people coming in about an hour. The people should have been here an hour ago. Thank you all for changing your clocks on time. With that, we all rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
To the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Okay, thank you. Just a few notes for you to know about the organization. Our last lecture in the spring series will be April 14th coming up. It will be at 2 p.m. And it's Gerald Kleinan will be here to talk about his book, The Pioneering Life and Service of Anna Ward Perkins, MD. Anna Ward Perkins, a very early medical doctor in our region, served in the Greenville and Westerlo area for most of her life, well into her 80s and 90s. Lots of interesting facts about her. We're really excited to have Gerald come and talk about her life and times. She's a remarkable woman, and we're looking forward to that. Also, for those of you who are local, even for those of you who are not local, we are wrapping up our membership drive as always. If you're interested in what you see around you, if you enjoy our lecture series, please consider taking a membership card in the back, filling it out, and joining the organization. We'd love to have you. And that brings us to our speaker today. So today we're thrilled to have Charles Starks here, who's a volunteer educator for the Destroyer Escort Historical Museum. He's done that for several years. Mr. Stark has been at the museum again for several years now, and he's one of an amazing group of volunteers who have steadfastly brought a remarkable set of skills to the preservation and telling the story of the USS Slater. And for those of you who have not been to the Slater or on the Slater, it is a remarkable experience, and it's the only experience you'll be able to have locally where you're on something like the USS Slater. To do it elsewhere and hear the stories about a war vessel, you either have to go to the Naval Museum in Buffalo or to the Intrepid Air and Space Museum in New York City. So we're really remarkably lucky to have this kind of historical facility so close to us, and it's a real testament to this remarkable group of dedicated individuals who continue to maintain, who brought it to life and continue to maintain it, which Charles will tell us all about. Again, it's one of those many volunteers. I understand Volunteer of the Year in 2021, which when you hear about the work that goes on at the Slater, being the Volunteer of the Year takes a lot of effort. So we're thrilled to have Charles with us today. And again, if you've not been there, please consider going to the Slater. In addition to supporting us, please consider supporting an organization like the Slater, because they're very hard to bring into being and they disappear very quickly. So we want to make sure that organizations like ours and the Slater are around for the next generation. So with that, welcome Charles to the podium. Thank you.
So some quick housekeeping things. Can all of you hear me? Okay. And John is getting away before I can warn him that I'm an incredible chatterbox when it comes to World War II. And it is his job to give me the hook, if necessary, at whatever point in the performance. And I will not take that personally, because I will keep talking. So my name is Charles Starks. I've been at the Slater for 9 years now. I'm a volunteer tour guide. And I take people around the ship and explain its part in World War II and what it was like to live and work and fight on board that ship then. We also have a restoration side with people who are keeping the ship afloat and in good shape, and gradually, bit by bit, restoring more pieces of the ship as we can. So it's not just an ongoing maintenance issue, but we also restore parts of the ship that haven't been touched since your Greek service. I'll talk all about this ship's history when we get to that. This is the Slater DE-766 in her non-World War II paint scheme. And we'll see pictures of her the way she currently looks now. She has what's called dazzle camouflage. That's a paint scheme that is designed to make it harder to fire a torpedo at the ship. It does not hide the ship on the surface of the ocean. Rather, it's intended to throw off the U-boat captain's calculations that are going to allow the torpedo to make a strike. There we go. So the Slater is a destroyer escort, and the first question naturally is, what is a destroyer escort? Now, in typical military fashion, a destroyer escort does not escort destroyers. That would be too sensitive. What we do is we escort convoys. It's primarily an anti-submarine warfare platform, also anti-aircraft platform. But the main trigger for the design and building of the 6 different classes of destroyer escort during World War II is all about convoy duty. The Battle of the Atlantic is going to be the longest battle in World War II. It's going to go on for 6 years, beginning with the Germans' invasion of Poland in September of '39 and ending with their surrender in May of '45. Now, pre-World War II and World War I, the Germans had tried to choke off the supplies to England with the U-boats of that era. Had come close to doing it, but ultimately failed. Before World War II, they're already thinking about doing that again. And they're trying to build up a U-boat force that is going to dominate the sea lanes and force England to surrender by cutting off its supplies. This is a more complex problem than you may think. Out of your U-boat force, only 1/3 of them are on station at any one time. 1/3 of them are in transit, going to or from station. 1/3 of them are in dock, being refitted, resupplied, letting the crews have a rest. If I have 300 U-boats, I can only bring 100 to bear on shipping. And the Atlantic is a big, big place. The first challenge for the U-boat force is actually to find the convoy. If we can get the convoy through without them finding us, we've won that round. They talk about aircraft and surface raiders. Yes, those are a problem, but they're not really ever in a position to choke off England. It's the U-boats that come the closest. And Hitler starts the war too soon. His Navy has told him we do not have the U-boat force to be sure of making this work, but he decides to invade Poland anyway, and away we go. Now, it's important to remember, from our point of view, we are late to the party here. In my opinion, World War II begins in 1931 when the Japanese invade China. By the time we come in Pearl Harbor, they've already been fighting for 10 years. The British have already been fighting for 2 years. So we show up late, but we bring a lot of good stuff. The need for convoy escort is apparent right from the start. Some of you may be aware of what Lend-Lease is. We are lending and leasing old destroyers to the British so they have more escort ships. The basic problem with pre-war design of destroyers is they're fuel hogs. And typically those older destroyers could not cross the Atlantic without being refueled. So if I'm taking a convoy from America to England, I have to refuel from a tanker halfway across. I have to refuel again in England. I have to refuel halfway back. So I'm hauling all this fuel that is not getting to the war effort. It's just supplying the destroyers. There's a need for smaller, more fuel-efficient weapons platforms, and that's where destroyer escorts come in. Now the Slater herself, her keel was laid in March of '43. She's commissioned on May 1st of 1944. So we're going to be having her 80th birthday this year. It takes a little while to make this all work. Even with the introduction of more destroyer escorts, there are still a lot of factors that are enabling the Germans to dominate the sea lanes up until about the spring of '43. Most of these issues are technological, and we tend not to think about World War II as a technology war the way we think about now. It's absolutely a war of technology. Radar is brand new in World War II. It's never been used in combat before, and the same is true of active sonar. So World War II was very much a question of the enemy develops something, we develop a counter something. The enemy develops a counter something, and on and on and on. And we win that technological race. We are able to out-technology the Germans and force them into a position where the U-boat arm just cannot be effective. An example of that, radar is actually an outgrowth of radio. And at the end of World War I, scientists are starting to realize that you can take a radio wave and bounce it off of something and figure out where that something is. Now, that's not so hard to do in the air, but in the water it's very different. The wave propagation and composition of the seawater makes that a tough nut to crack. But eventually, what the U-boats find is that they're not safe on the surface because they can be detected by airborne radar, and they're not safe underwater because they can be detected by shipborne sonar. And those, in my mind, are really the technological innovations that make the U-boats unable to starve England into submission. And that all takes time. This stuff is all being developed at breakneck speed, but it's still flat-out basic research that you're trying to convert into a machine that works, and then mass produce that machine and get it to the front lines. So it takes time. But by the spring of '43, we are starting to win the Battle of the Atlantic. We're driving the U-boats away. They're still coming out. They are not having the success that they did in the first 3 years of the war. One of the statistics I give people when I give tours is that 5% of destroyer escorts were lost to enemy combat action during World War II. German U-boats lost 75%. And that number tells the whole story. It tells you who won. So one of the things that comes out of World War II is Rosie the Riveter and Wendy the Welder. And we can see pictures of these young women there in their work garb. World War II has some tremendous social implications, and part of that is women in the workforce. Now, why are we suddenly letting women in the workforce for these jobs that prior to this we all said they couldn't do? Well, because the men have run out. Right? I have a personal connection to this. My mother became a draftsman during World War II because of this, and that ended up being her career. She worked for General Electric in Pittsfield, Massachusetts. So without the help of these women, this isn't going to happen. You know, women are not only in construction, they're also moving aircraft around, they're learning to be pilots, they're doing everything they possibly can except being on the front lines. And that's not a barrier you're going to crack until later in our society. To give you an idea of American industrial capacity, this is a row of destroyer escorts. And a small fraction of the 563 that we built during World War II. Out of those 563, only 5 left. 2 in the United States, one is the Slater, the other is in Galveston, Texas. 1 in Brazil, 1 in Colombia, 1 in Thailand. The ship in Thailand, which is now named the Pin Cloud, is still in service in the Royal Thai Navy. So almost 80 years old, still going to work for a living every day. All the rest have been scrapped or sunk, used as target ships, given to other countries and worn out. Up until 2 years ago, October of '22, there's a 6th in the Philippine Navy, the Raha Punaban. She was going to be a museum ship. Unfortunately, she was caught at anchor by a typhoon, capsized, and sank. She will probably not be restored. So this is a diminishing resource. You know, it's a steel ship sitting in the water. We all know what happens when you mix steel and water. Most of these destroyer escorts led reasonably mundane lives. You know, your job is to take a convoy of up to 80 or 100 merchant ships, and along with a number of other escorts, get that convoy to England. And then you're going to take a convoy of empties and come back. And you will detect perhaps U-boats. You will attack them if you can, if it's feasible. The Slater did make some depth charge attacks. We don't know if she ever damaged or sank the U-boat. It's important to remember you're fighting an enemy that can be 300 feet below you. You have no idea what's going on down there. The destruction of the U-boat arm is not the goal of the destroyer escort. The goal of the destroyer escort is to get the convoy through. If I can avoid the U-boat, that's going to be my first choice, so they don't get a shot at us. If I have to fight to drive them away, I'll do that, so they don't get a shot at us. So the Slater, though, did have a part in a fairly important moment in the Battle of the Atlantic, and that was the capture of a U-boat in the Caribbean. very small part. As the war progressed, we began to put together what were called hunter-killer groups. This is an escort aircraft carrier, or a small aircraft carrier, with 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 different escorting anti-submarine ships. And their job is to go out and look for U-boats, try to find them, and sink them. Now we have an advantage because we've broken a lot of the German naval code. So we can read sometimes by captured cipher where a particular U-boat's going to be, and that makes it a lot easier to find it. So the commander of this task force, built around the USS Guadalcanal, a man named Daniel Gallery, who was in charge of the whole hunter-killer group, had decided that he would train people on each of the anti-submarine warfare ships to be prepared to capture a German U-boat. That's not going to happen if the U-boat's underwater. The first thing you have to do is force the U-boat to the surface, then you have to encourage the Germans to abandon it, and then you have to keep it from sinking. They find U-505, they attack it, they do actually force it to the surface, the boarding party goes away. I'm going to ask you to put yourself in the position of these young men for a second who've trained for this, but what exactly are you asking them to do? You're asking them to go into an unfamiliar submarine that is sinking because the Germans have opened the sea cocks to let the water in, and they also have timed explosives on board to scuttle the ship. And we know this. And they have to get into that ship, turn the sea cocks off, disarm the explosives, and not die. That's asking a lot. That's asking a lot of these people. They pull it off. They capture 505. They force it to the surface. The Germans abandon ship. We board it, manage to stabilize it. You can see it's not really in good shape. In this picture here, it's thinking about sinking very strong. But they don't sink it. And they eventually put it under tow and start taking it back to Jamaica. In typical military fashion, when Gallery reports this, the first thing they do is yell at him. Because one of the problems with reading the German naval codes is if the Germans begin to suspect we're doing that, they're going to change the codes. And we won't be able to read them anymore. So we don't want to give them a hint that somehow we've figured this out. Well, if they know we've captured an intact submarine with an intact Enigma code machine, they're going to change the codes and we'll be locked out for a while from reading their traffic. So the first thing they do is yell at them for this. And then they start thinking about it, calmer heads prevail. They end up towing this to the United States eventually. They take the German crew and they put them in a completely separate POW camp where they can't communicate with anybody, they can't write to their families and tell them they're alive, they essentially vanish. Now, if you're one of those men's families in Germany and your loved one's U-boat goes out and doesn't come back, what do you think happened to them? They're all dead. And that persists until the end of the war, when these people are suddenly allowed to go back to Germany and tell their people, hey, I'm not dead, I'm alive. It's something you've got to do in wartime. The Slater's part in all this was to bring back one of 2 new torpedoes that the U-505 carried. We talked a little bit about that technological cycle. Part of that is the Germans developed an acoustic torpedo. Now this is a torpedo that is going to home in on a ship's engine noise. So I no longer have to come to periscope depth to fire it. I no longer really have to aim it. I can just kind of send it towards the convoy, and hopefully it is going to find a ship's engine, home in on it, and blow the stern off that ship. Now this is a very primitive device. It's got 4 microphones that are gauging which is the strongest sound, and those microphones control the direction of the torpedo. So it's kind of looking for a sound and finding it, and it gets closer. Of course, the ship is moving, so the sound location is changing. It's going to keep trying to find that loudest sound and home in on that. Pretty effective weapon, has some teething problems. Germans don't end up deploying an awful lot of them before the war's over. But the Slater brought back one of those torpedoes to the United States for testing. And we're testing it because we want to figure out a counter weapon. World War II being an ongoing emergency, the counter weapon they figure out is called a Foxer. And it's essentially a noise decoy that's towed behind the ship that makes more noise than the engines. So the torpedo says, aha, the engine, and will either hit the Foxer and detonate, or it will just keep circling it, keep looking for it. The Foxer is basically a collection of pipes chained together whose clanging resonancy mimics the sound of an engine. Again, this is the 40s. Things were a lot simpler back then. The Foxer as a counter weapon has some problems. For starters, you can't deploy it pretty much over 12 knots or it'll break up. When you do deploy it, it has limited life because of the banging of the pipes. Eventually things wear out. And while you have it deployed, you can't use your own sonar because it deafens your own sonar. But it is a defensive tactic. And it kind of works. Again, the Germans don't really get the acoustic torpedo into action in quantities enough to make a difference.
What are those 5 Destroyer Escort names?
The Pillsbury, the Pope, the Flaherty, the Chatelaine, and the Jenks.
Were they all involved with that
Yes,
operation?
that was part of the Hunter Killer Group. Guadalcanal's lot listed here. That was the escort carrier, where Gallery was the commodore of that entire group. So the concept of the Hunter Killer Group was, we're going to find the U-boat, you need a couple of escorts to stay with the carrier and guard it, and send the other escorts out to kill the U-boat. And this is not now a case of driving the U-boat away from a convoy. This is a case of, we want to sink you. And we're going to stay with you and keep you underwater until either we sink you, or you're forced to the surface by lack of air and battery power, and you have to abandon ship. So that comes about because we have the industrial capacity to make enough ships to do that. Up until the creation of the Hunter Killer Groups, it's entirely a defensive war for the convoy escorts. Just trying to keep away from the convoys, we do eventually reach the point where we can take the offensive and go out looking for it. The other destroyer escort that is a part of history is the USS Mason. When World War II starts, the American military is segregated. African Americans and Filipinos are allowed on combat ships, but they're not allowed to have combat roles. Typically, they are acting as stewards, serving the officers their food. They're sometimes doing minor technical work. At battle stations, they'll pass ammunition or they'll act as stretcher bearers for damage control parties. They will not be allowed to use weapons. That changes because of the same reason that we got the women involved. We run out of guys. A lot of people in World War II are saying this isn't going to work. But the USS Mason was the first integrated ship in the U.S. Navy in World War II. White officers, African American seamen, their record was excellent. The ship was on the verge of breaking in half and breaking apart in a storm. The crew saved it. So these changes, once you allow women to have a more full role in society, once you allow minorities to have a more full role in society, I think that makes our society stronger. If you let everybody play, I think you have a much better thing for everyone. And once these guys get their foot in the door, they don't look back. Now to add to that, you probably have all heard of the Tuskegee Airmen, flew P-51 Mustangs in fighter escort roles. That's an African American unit. You may not have heard of the 761st Tank Destroyer Battalion. African Americans with white officers manning tank destroyers in Europe, fighting the Germans in World War II. So all this stuff happens that has these ripple effects down to us today. So here's a picture of the Slater in her World War II dazzle camouflage, and that is the way she looks now. She is historically painted to fit in with the paint scheme she was worn in May of '45. And you can see how it's kind of geometric and irregular and different colors, all designed to fool that U-boat captain. Remember, he is looking through very primitive optics to try and aim this torpedo to get it to arrive in the same place as a moving target. If I can screw up one of his calculations, torpedo will miss. Now, the jury is going to be still out on whether or not dazzle camouflage works. Dazzle camouflage actually goes back to World War I. If you're in the Army and you're in a camouflage uniform and you're hiding in a bush and the enemy walks by, doesn't see you, you can assume that your camouflage worked. But if somebody fires a torpedo at you and they miss, What if the torpedo malfunctioned? What if the captain wasn't that good at math? You can't really be sure that dazzle camouflage is effective. On the other hand, you have to paint the ship something. It's steel in water. So the little bit of extra work I have to do to paint it in dazzle instead of just a flat haze gray, why not? Why not? Go ahead. So I can't honestly say that that's effective or not. Maybe yes, maybe no. Now, this gentleman in the lower right is our first captain, Captain Marcel Blanc. He is a reserve naval officer. He's a merchant mariner before the war, but he's in the Navy Reserve. So he's called up during the war, commands a minesweeper for about 3 months, and then is given command of the Slater, which he's originally commissioned. When he takes command of the Slater, he's 30 years old. Most of his crew are 18 or 19 years old. His officers are 21, 22 years old. He is the old man in a number of different senses of this show. Turns out to be an excellent captain. He's remembered as strict but fair. If you did a good job, you're going to be okay. Now, at the end of the war, he leaves the Navy, goes back to being a merchant mariner. He has a long career at sea. For a while, he commands a tugboat in New Orleans Harbor. And then finally retires from sea and passed away in 2002 at the age of 88. He lived to see that his ship was going to be saved. You know, so many of these ships were given away, scrapped, sunk. He lived to see that the Slater was going to live. And he donated a number of the artifacts that are in the captain's cabin now. His uniforms, some personal items, all that stuff belonged to him, and he came home after all that time. He also asked, and we granted, that when he passed away, his ashes be scattered from the stern of the ship. So we did that. And so much of that speaks to the amazing importance of these connections for these young men. You know, so many of these men are high school graduates, some of them not even graduated from high school. And they are thrown into this life and this war. They come to the Navy, where it seems like everything has a different term for it. The Navy being the Navy. And of course, if you use the wrong word, you get yelled at, don't you? They're given very, very brief training. Before World War II, boot camp for sailors is 12 weeks. By 1945, 4 weeks. So 4 weeks of land training, and you're going on board a warship where you're expected to hold up your end, whatever it is you're doing. And that's asking a lot of these young men. The stress of that situation, the endurance needed just to deal with being at sea for long periods of time. The fact that in your back of your mind, you are aware that you could be in combat at any second, that you could be killed. That makes a very, very tight emotional bond for these young men. And I think because Captain Blanc wanted to be buried on the ship, not in any of the places where he lived when he was working on land, or where he raised his family, or where he lived in retirement, I think that says it all about that experience for these young people. So World War II ends, and the United States finds itself with an incredible array of military equipment that we no longer need. And furthermore, we would prefer not to pay to maintain it. So we can either scrap it and get rid of it, or what we turn out to do is to give a lot of it away. And we give it away to countries whose militaries have been decimated during World War II. So a number of ships are donated to other countries. The Rahal Hunabon, the Philippines Navy ship that I mentioned, originally the USS Atherton, is donated after World War II to, of all countries, Japan, the people who had just been fighting for 4 years. She eventually donates that ship to the Philippines. The Slater goes to Greece. She becomes the Atos, which is a Greek word for eagle, and is one of their top-of-the-line lead warships. She's a good choice for them. She's shallow draft, she's cheap to operate, she has enough force, you know, to deal with anything she might have to deal with in the Greek archipelago. She doesn't have to fight a world war, but she has 40 years in the Greek Navy. She's given to them in 1951, they decommissioned her in 1991. When the Destroyer Escort Historical Association, Destroyer Escort Sailors Association, went looking for a ship to preserve, they picked her because she had been in service up until fairly recently. So she was still afloat. She wasn't in the best shape. If you take a look at a couple of these pictures, you can see that our old friend Mr. Rust is really making an appearance here. And nothing against the Greek Navy. It's like owning an old car you're about to get rid of. At some point you say, why am I putting money into this thing? I'm just going to junk it. So by the time DISA gets Atos, formerly Slater, she's not in great shape. And as proof of that, I'll offer the fact that A, she had to be towed back from Greece. She's not capable of making the journey under her own power. And when the towing company sent someone to look at her to estimate the job, they specified that all the money for the tow had to be paid up front. So I think that'll tell you what their professional eyes saw when they were looking at the site. She made it. That's all that matters. She got back to New York. We were initially down with the Intrepid, came up to Albany in '97. So the Greeks had changed her in a number of ways, nothing that couldn't be put back the way it was. Again, it's a tool that they're using, so it evolves. So as things become available, I'm going to take out this old thing and replace it with a better thing. They had put a roof on top of the flying bridge where the captain and the bridge watch are, and you can see here a picture of the crane taking that off, which is not a World War II accurate piece of work. The other picture is her in dry dock, being painted in her dazzle camouflage. The center middle picture is a picture of the galley before it was restored. And then to the right, picture of our whaleboat. The whaleboat is not a lifeboat, it's the ship-to-shore taxi. The Navy built about 26,000 whaleboats during World War II. They went on all sizes of ships. We have one of the few left in the world that still works, both floats and runs. All of this took a lot of time. As I said when we first started this discussion, we're constantly trying to restore additional parts of the ship. We usually have one or two major restoration projects going on at any time. And that's a little bit of a juggling act because, of course, we're open from April through November with people walking through the ship as guests. So to try and get the ongoing maintenance and the restoration and the guests all to intermingle successfully is a bit of a challenge. One of the big challenges every year is how to paint the deck. Because, of course, the most wear on the deck comes from the tour route. On the other hand, you don't have good painting days every day in New England. And it takes time for the paint to dry. So sometimes painting the deck gets a little innovative. It's not unusual for me to hit yellow tape on my tour route and have to go a different way. And I know why that is. It's got to get done. And this is the way she looks today. That's her dazzle camouflage. That is her moored at her place in the Hudson. Right now, the two restoration projects we have are both below decks, so you don't really see those. The tour goes both below decks, on the main deck, and up 2 decks. It takes an hour to an hour and a half. We show people, everything we can show them. Sometimes if I have someone whose family served in the Navy doing a particular job and that's a little bit off the tour route, I'll kind of wander off a little bit. The real point is to make a connection with people, to show them what it was like to be here. And it's important to remember that for these young men, unless they had a relative who had served in the military, what did they know about the military, about any branch of the military? What they knew was what they had seen at the movie theater. That was the only concept they had of the military. Now, how many people here think the movies are super accurate? So I think I'm going to go do this, and then I hit reality, and it's nothing like that. It's nothing like that. There's a saying that in combat, the life of a warship is measured in minutes. So I'm going to spend months doing my job, whatever it is, on board the ship, every 4 hours, 4 hours on, 4 hours off, same job, same people, same place, and all of a sudden, we're in combat, we have an emergency. That's not what the movies show. And here's some of my coworkers, both interns and older folks like myself. We have 6 to 8 college students every year as interns. And they not only work as tour guides, but they do maintenance on the ship, they do archival and curatorial work. Some of them are actually in the pipeline to work in museums and curatorial work, some are not. Doesn't matter, we're looking for people who enjoy talking to people and enjoy talking about history. And then this is my boss on the left, Shannon. Couple of ideas of what routine maintenance looks like. It means getting into very small spaces. And as you get older, you find less inclined to get contorted into these positions. And you also don't fit in them quite as well. We have a couple of younger volunteers on the maintenance side who are specifically the bilge rats, because they're the only ones who can fit into the bilges. And we check the bilges every week. One of our sayings at the ship is, well, she didn't sink. And we're trying to keep that true. But you need to check the bilges to see if you have a hole, because the hole's going to let in the water. And that's your first warning, is why is it damp down here? And this is part of our mission statement. People ask me sometimes why I volunteer as a tour guide. I'm not a veteran. I studied history in college. I still enjoy studying military history. Of all eras, I tend during the summer to read a lot of World War II because that's what I'm doing. But I find history throughout that time period interesting. You can tell I like talking to people. I warned you I was a chatterbox. I enjoy taking people around the ship. I enjoy taking them back 80 years. And I'm not sure any of you remember back 80 years. You might, some of you. Kids, though, you don't know this, kids live in the now, because that's all they know. If I'm a 10-year-old, all I know is the past 10 years. And to open a child up to the concept that there was a before you, and it was very different. You know, if I want to shock young people, what I do is I tell them, when I was a kid, I was your age, remember that phrase? We all hated that when we were kids. You know, when I was your age, if I didn't see a TV show on schedule, I'd wait 6 months to see it again. And that's a completely alien concept. Similarly, you're going to go on this ship, there is no telephone, there is no email, there is no internet, and if you're lucky, you can write letters back and forth and you get them eventually. And especially in the Pacific, the mail delivery was so erratic that when the guys got their mail, they could have 10 or 20 or 30 letters from their family stacked up. And what they used to do was organize them by postmark and read the latest one first, make sure everything at home was okay, and then they'd start from the earliest one and read them in order. And kids just don't get that. Which is fine. You know, they're going to grow up and have kids, and those kids aren't going to understand what they understand. That's just desserts, right? So we are open April to November, Wednesday to Saturday, 10 to 4. We also do school tours and, you know, whatever. I'll take one person around the ship, I'll take 20 people around the ship. It doesn't matter to me. One of the nice things about working at the Slater is that they have some certain basic stuff they want us all to cover. But then within that framework, I can talk about what interests me. And you will get a different tour from every single tour guide we have. You can tell I tend to talk about technology, about the technological evolution of the war. We tend to talk about the sociological evolution of the war, because to me those trends are what informs us now. That's part of our life right now, and makes a big difference to us right now. A lot of that stuff started 80 years ago. I just have such a good time doing this. I'm sure I'm conveying that to you, but I really do. I look forward to to going to work most days. The days when it's really rainy and cold and miserable in November where nobody's going to show up, man, that's much fun. But I'll take rounds, like I said, when it's busy, the most people I've ever taken at a time is 25. And that's a challenge in a small ship, trying to fit everybody in. But I'll take one around, no problem with that. I've been privileged to meet a number of World War II veterans who served not just in the Navy, but in all branches in World War II. And I jokingly tell people from the Army and the Air Force and the Marines that today only we are allowing people from other branches on board. And I've met their families and their relatives who are coming to make a connection with them. And I've heard some great, great stories from these people. And I tell them right up front, you know, you give me a good story, I'm stealing it. No question about it. I will recycle your story. And as long as I'm here, it will live on. I had the privilege of taking a Greek veteran around the ship who actually served on the Aetos. Very nice guy named Paul. He was now in his 50s. He had brought his family to see where he had spent his military time. When he was that age, they had compulsory military service. I think it was 3 years back then. And so he'd been assigned to the Slater for his military service. Paul had a very lucky gig in the Navy. His cousin was the captain of the ship. So he became essentially the captain's valet. Go for it, guy. You know, we're pulling into port. Let me take your luggage out to the car, Captain. Let me drive you up to your house, Captain. Let me run errands for you, Captain. Whatever the captain needed, right? We all understand the captain of the ship, and even little kids know this right from the start. What do you do when the captain gives you an order? You obey. They get that right without being told. So one of the things Paul used to do was bring the captain his meals. Right? That's what a valet does. And I had read in U.S. Navy memoirs on ships where the officers got better food. Not all the food made it from the galley to the wardroom. There would be some shrinkage along the way. And so I told Paul, I said, you know, you're long out of the Navy, nobody can do anything to you now. And I explained this U.S. concept, and I asked him, was this the same in the Greek Navy? And he looked at me and said, yes, that happened. So he used to eat parts of his own cousin's lunch when he was bringing the food to the wardroom. People are people. Doesn't matter what area, doesn't matter what country. Right. Does anybody have any questions? Yeah.
Two questions, really. The hours are from 10 to 4. You can just show up like at 10:20 and so.
Yes.
It's not scheduled.
What we try and do is to not make people wait more than 10 or 15 minutes. So in ways, it's a lot like a restaurant. You just walk in, you may have to wait a few minutes, but we'll get you on the tour.
And second question, you may have said this and I didn't catch it. U-boat means what, underwater?
Untersea Boot. Undersea boat. Submarine. Right?
Okay.
So I'll digress because it's very easy to throw me off track. The full term in German for tank is Panzerkampfwagen, which means steel battle wagon. And it's my theory that one of the reasons the Germans lost the war is because when they were on the radio yelling for tanks, they said send Panzerkampfwagen, and we just said send tanks. And we were much more efficient. That is a joke. Yeah.
I was wondering, could you explain the sort of the differences between a destroyer escort and a traditional World War II destroyer?
Sure. So, a World War II destroyer will be about 10% longer and about 10% wider than we are. And it's the 10% wider that makes a difference. They can carry bigger weapons, they can carry more weapons, and they are going to generally be faster. Most of the differences in class in destroyer escorts is based upon propulsion. So the Slater, for example, had a diesel-electric propulsion system, and it works exactly the way a railroad locomotive does. I use diesel to spin generators to make electrical power, and that electrical power powers the engines. It's very fuel efficient. She could go 11,800 miles on a full load of diesel. But it's slow. A destroyer is meant to keep up with the fleet. I'm escorting battleships and cruisers and aircraft carriers. I need to be ideally able to do 30 plus knots. Our top speed is 21 knots.
Which is perfect for a livery ship.
Right. So you're going to have a difference in size, and that difference in size translates to a better propulsion system and more weapons. You know, it was only toward the end of the war they started equipping destroyer escorts with 5-inch guns. The Slater has 3-inch guns. Part of that is because of that size issue. And you're going to have much more, you're going to have a corresponding increase in crew size. We have a crew of about 216 in World War II. Destroyer's going to have about 300 a little bit.
One other quick thing. You said that the camouflage pattern was to throw off calculations for U-boats. Would that go for gunnery as well?
It could. All the guns involved in the U-boat war are going to be optically aimed. You know, so we have radar on board the ship. We don't really have radar-directed gunnery, particularly, at least not good radar-directed gunnery, because the ranges are so short. The 3-inch 50 caliber gun only has a range of about 6 miles. So most of the time I'm going to be firing at something I can see. And the same is true with the U-boats that carried either 88 millimeter or 105 millimeter guns. They're going to be firing optically as well. You get up into battleships and cruisers, they start having radar-directed gunnery where they can fire, not quite over the horizon, but they can fire things you can't see. If you're approaching a U-boat in a destroyer escort at night, which you have on radar, so it's on the surface, you know it's there, one of the tactical choices the captain has to make is whether or not to open fire with the main guns. You might get lucky, and you might hit that U-boat with a shell that from their point of view comes out of nowhere. But you may also most likely miss, and now you've alerted them and they're going to start diving. So all these decisions have to be made by the destroyer escort captain in a few seconds. There's not a lot of time to think about this. And remember, you've just spent 3 weeks doing exactly the same thing over and over again, and nothing has happened. So you kind of gotten in this mode of, hey, this is going to continue for a while, and then suddenly it doesn't. So does that answer? Yeah. It's also much cheaper to build a destroyer escort. The Slater cost about $2,1944 and much faster. Our construction time was 14 months. During the war, as a publicity stunt, they actually built a destroyer escort in 27 days. And that was really propaganda. It was just to say, you know, look how fast we can build this. Now that was all pre-staged and pre-set up and pre-fabbed and everything. They could get away with that. It wasn't the way our ship was built. Any other questions? Yeah.
Life of the crew. I mean, cold, hot, miserable.
So the hull of the Slater is 3/8 of an inch thick. And if you come out on tour, when we go below decks, you'll see there's no insulation between the crew's quarters and the outside of the ship. So you live in a 3/8 of an inch steel house in the North Atlantic when it's below freezing, or in the Pacific when it's nice and hot. And I think I've answered your question. The air supply ducts below decks are about yay so. Though this in my mind, I'm an amateur, but this in my mind is not adequate heating and cooling. Furthermore, there's no air conditioning on board the ship. All you're doing is moving the air around with fans. Let's see if you guys have an old fan here. They're kind of like 8-inch fans. You've all seen them. The old black fans. So they're trying, but they're not really working very well. The other thing that figures largely in the crew's mind is an outgrowth of personnel. If I'm the captain, I would like to have 3 watches, because that means the guys can work for 4 hours and be off for 8. And when you're off, you're not really off. If they have other work for you to do with maintenance, you go to the battle station, you're doing training, you're still working. But ideally, you would have 4 on and 8 off. However, the key jobs, engine room, combat information center where the radar or sonar are, watch keeping on the bridge and in the pilot house, there are certain key jobs that have to be filled by experienced people. If I don't have enough experienced people, I end up with 2 watches. And that means you're working 4 hours on and 4 hours off, and again being pulled away to do maintenance and training and emergencies. In combat areas especially, these guys are chronically sleep deprived. And one of the things they really want to do if they get minutes themselves is just sleep. And that's all. You know, you can go without sleep for quite a while, especially when you're younger. It does catch up with you eventually.
Yeah, two questions. The names of the escorts, there's all peoples,
Yes.
and then who's Mr. or Seaman Slater?
Okay. So in World War II, generally, naval ships are named, battleships are named after states, cruisers are named after cities, aircraft carriers are named after battles with some exceptions. For example, the Wasp and the Hornet and the Enterprise, famous carrier from World War II, there's no battle of the Wasp. But generally speaking, they name those after battles. Destroyers are named after officers who were killed in action. Destroyer escorts are named after enlisted men who were killed in action. And we're named after Paul Slater. Paul was a 20mm anti-aircraft gunner on the USS San Francisco, that's a cruiser. She was attacked off the coast of Guadalcanal by a Japanese torpedo bomber on November 12, 1942. He stayed at his post, firing at the oncoming plane. They didn't shoot it down. Unfortunately, it didn't crash in the ocean, crashed into the ship, killing him at his station. So he was awarded the Navy Cross, and the ship was named after him. And one of the questions I get on tours sometimes is, well, medals and naming ships after people, that's all very nice, but how do you recognize everybody who did something brave in World War II? And the answer is, you can't. You cannot. Sometimes bravery just goes unnoticed in the heat of battle, and there's really nothing you can do about that. You do try and commemorate some people who were brave in one way or another. I think it's brave just to go out there and do the job. Now that is a very long-term endurance kind of bravery. It's not a split second where you say, well, I'm going to stand and fight. This is getting up every 4 hours and going to do your job when you're cold and wet, or when you're hot and wet, or when you're hungry, or when you're thirsty, or whatever's going on. So we are named after a person, but I like to think that that stands for everybody in World War II who did what they felt they had to do. Maybe that's the key. Hang on a sec. There was a question back here somewhere. Yeah.
Did the Greeks go to the Parsons propulsion system for
No.
availability, or they kept the American to get buying parts from us?
They kept the American system. This is a free ship. Now, down below we have 4 16-cylinder diesels. And we had originally thought that they were all original to the ship. Last year, maybe 2 years ago, our curator was down poking around, which is his job, to look at all the nooks and crannies of the ship. And he realized that the serial numbers on one engine didn't match her original specifications. That engine had come from the USS Jack, which was a diesel-electric submarine that was given to the Greeks after World War II. So at some point, one of the diesel engines failed so badly, it had to be replaced. Now you would have to see the size of these engines and then extrapolate how I'm going to get it out of the ship. And if you look on the port side, there is a big welded plate where they disconnected everything they possibly could off the engine and then slid it sideways to get it out and put the Jack's engine in its place. But there's really no point for the Greeks in doing that. This is a free ship, I'm going to work with
The
it.
Greeks tended to buy more stuff from the United Kingdom. That's why I asked.
Right.
Yeah.
These were all donations.
I figured that a 40-year career, something had to wear out at that point.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's really kind of amazing that the 3 engines survived as long as they did. 3 years on active service in the U.S. Navy, 5 years laid up, and then 4 years in the Greek Navy. It's a real tribute to American engineering that only one of them failed.
Yeah.
I don't even know how many thousands, tens, hundreds of thousands of miles are on those engines.
10 hours.
Yeah, do you have a question?
How big were the convoys, and what was the ratio of the escorts to the convoys?
So, you run into a lot of problems with convoys, most of which is scheduling. I need to get all the goods and everything onto ports on the coast of America to load these ships. I then need to rendezvous these ships off the coast with their escorts. And what they ended up doing was having basically 3 flavors of convoys. You had slow convoys where the merchant ships moved 7 to 10 knots. You had fast convoys where the merchant ships moved over 10 knots. And then you have individually sailing ships like passenger liners that were so fast that a U-boat couldn't get a shot at them. So they would actually sail unescorted because of their speed. If you work out the math, as long as you keep zigzagging and you keep going fast enough, your boat can't get in position. You get a shot. So by the time the convoy system takes hold, you can have 80 to 100 ships in a convoy, merchant ships. Now the escort problem is, at the start of the war, there just aren't enough escorts. And the escorts are not equipped with effective weapons and technology. So you're going to put as many escorts as you can into the convoy, but it's really a variable depending upon what's available. If a U-boat sees a convoy and it's escorted, even if the escorts aren't going to be very effective, it is going to change how they attack the convoy. So the presence of that ship alone, even if it's not the best ship, even if it's not well armed, is going to start deterring the U-boat. Now, not entirely. The U-boats break through a lot in these early convoys from 39 through 43 and do a lot of damage. But you're kind of working with what you've got. Yeah.
What was happening in the Pacific? No need or impractical?
You still had destroyer escorts in the Pacific. Pacific Naval War ends up being a different kind of war. The Germans right from the start wanted to choke off merchant supply in the United Kingdom. The Japanese philosophy was that their submarines were scouts for the main battle fleet. So they didn't really send their submarines to attack merchant ships. You know, once I attack, I've given away my position, and now you're going to start looting whatever ships are coming through there around that position. So Japanese submarines tended to only attack warships, and it made them much less effective. In the Pacific, you're going to see smaller convoys, less well escorted. So destroyer escorts can still play that role, but it's not going to be the main thrust of what they're doing. Now, as the escort carriers come online, those are slower than fleet carriers. Destroyer escorts also start taking a role as escorting those slower carriers because now my speed is sufficient to keep up with the carrier. And one of the things they do is to act as what's called a plane guard. I'm going to have a destroyer escort or a destroyer in front and back of the carrier, and if a carrier pilot fails to make a takeoff or fails to make a landing and goes in the water, it's now my job to go save that aircrew. And what I tell people is that in World War II, the deal with the carrier was that if you brought back aircrew to the carrier alive, you got ice cream. Because the aircraft carriers had ice cream makers and you didn't. So you had both a professional and a personal reason for getting that job. As we started doing the island invasions in the Pacific, the other role that destroyer escorts pick up is as radar ships. So if you can imagine that we're attacking an island, Iwo Jima for example, and close to the island we have the transports and the supply ships unloading. We have a protective screen of battleships and cruisers to try and safeguard them. And then further away we have the carriers which are conducting airstrikes and providing combat air patrol over this whole thing. Because radar is really radio, it only has an effective range of about 20 miles in World War II. So if I can set up a ring of picket ships with radar at that 20-mile range, I've now extended my early warning system 20 miles. And a lot of the DEs in the Pacific ended up doing just that, being on radar picket duty. And the disadvantage to that is that once we get into the kamikaze phase of the war in the Pacific, the kamikaze pilots are not well trained. There's a common misconception that you don't train kamikaze pilots to land. And that's a mistake, because you need to be able to keep training that guy until he's sufficiently trained to get in the air and get to the target. That requires at least one landing that he's going to have to perform, so they are trained to land. What they are not good at is navigation, because that's complicated over an ocean where there are no landmarks. And they're not good at evading anti-aircraft fire. They just don't have the skills to do that. So they tend to come in straight at you and they're easier to shoot down. I read a memoir by a Japanese airman who had survived the entire war flying zero. And by the time we got to the kamikaze phase, he was a senior guy. He was still flying combat missions, but he was, you know, one of their professional people. His job was to take the kamikaze group, 5, 10, 20 planes, and they would form on him, and he would navigate to the target, and then because he was too important to risk, he would turn back and let those other men fly out to die. And I ask you to put yourself in his position as a professional aviator defending his country, how that must have felt. So the problem with being a radar picket ship was that these untrained pilots, if you came in close to the water, the radar had a harder time picking you up, but it also meant you couldn't see very far. So the first ship you saw was one of these picket ships, and you would pop up to attack that ship. And that wasn't the ship you wanted the carriers and the transports and the vulnerable stuff, but you didn't know how to do that, you didn't know any better. So a lot of the radar picket ships got attacked in the island hopping phase, once the Japanese went to the kamikaze system. So that was dangerous, you know, for the people doing that. And again, like I said, measured in minutes, the ship's life. Any other questions? Yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, timing-wise, did the destroyer escorts in the Battle of the Atlantic come online about the same time that we closed the Mid-Atlantic air gap?
To a certain extent, you know, that's actually a good question. I should do some research. I don't know when the first DEs came online. We're certainly not in that first wave. We're commissioned in May of 44. So there are 43 DEs that are coming into action. And they're closing the air gap on what he's talking about. If you just kind of briefly look at America and England, land aircraft can't cover the center of that distance. And the U-boats know that. So when the convoys got into that air gap, that was when the U-boats tried to attack you because you didn't have air support. Gradually, once they start allocating longer range aircraft to that and start using escort carriers to provide local air support, that whole equation changes for the U-boats. What an aircraft is going to do is it's going to force me to be underwater, and a diesel-electric submarine just can't move very far underwater. The battery power isn't sufficient. So he's going to drive me under, and while I'm under the convoy, he gets past me. I didn't get a chance to shoot at him. So there were probably DEs in early 43 when they were right in the process of doing that, but I couldn't speak for sure as to the time.
Interesting double thing to hit them with.
So much of the Battle of the Atlantic is won by technology. I'll tell you guys a technology story. Are you getting ready to kick me out? I'll always alert. The belligerents going to World War II all working on radar. But the Germans feel that it is never going to be possible to make radar small enough to fit on a warship or in a plane. So they have radar, but it's air defense radar against bombing raids, and it's big. It's land radar installations that are huge. The British and the Americans cooperating together to figure out ways to make radar much smaller. We can start putting it on ships. We can start putting it in planes. This is a nasty shock to the Germans, but they figured out what they're doing. And the first countermeasure they come up with is a radar detector called MATOX. Now, MATOX can be carried in a submarine, but it's not waterproof. So when I surface the submarine, I have to bring the radar antenna up from the submarine and mount it on the conning tower where it's not going to be underwater. And it will detect radar. If I'm being painted with a radar signal, MATOX will go off, and I can say, uh-oh, I'm on somebody's radar, I better go underwater. Well, that was the whole point, was to force you to submerge. It doesn't matter if we find you or not. If you submerge now, you can't chase the convoy. So we figure out that they have MATOX, and we change wavelengths. And that's a technological thing. And then suddenly MATOX doesn't work anymore. And there's an interesting side note. An English pilot was captured by the Germans when his plane was shot down. And under interrogation, he managed to convince them that when MATOX was operating, we could detect the signal of the MATOX. So that meant they stopped using it. For about 3 months, they had no radar detection, all because of this big fat lie this guy dreamed up. Nevertheless, they come up with a second type of radar detector called Naxos, which is now detecting Allied radar again, but then we go to get another frequency and they never get around to detecting that. So here again is that back and forth technology thing going on that makes such a big difference. Because now, in an aircraft, which they thought you couldn't equip aircraft with radar, I can find you at night when you're surfaced, and I can attack you out of no place. You don't know that I'm coming. Combat aircraft don't show lights. And I can see on my radar screen where you are. You have no idea I'm there. That's very exciting. Any other questions? Yeah.
The movie Greyhound.
Yes.
I finally saw that.
Oh, good.
What was the feeling about that movie?
So, very good movie. If you get a chance to see it, I recommend it strongly.
What's the name?
Greyhound. Greyhound. Now, this is based on a 1955 novel by C.S. Forester called The Good Shepherd. And that's very close to the Greyhound story. It's much more from the perspective of the captain, a lot of interior thought on the captain's part. It's an excellent novel, even though it's a 50s novel. You can't really do that in a movie very well. You know, it's hard to do that voiceover kind of thinking stuff. So Greyhound is very accurate in terms of ship handling depiction and how it was like to be in the crew and tactics, you know, the tactical decisions the captain had to make. And now for the quibbles, right? It's always important when you're a historian to disagree, because if we all agree on history, we're never going to get any place. So, in the first place, Tom Hanks, who plays the captain of the ship whose call sign is Greyhound, that's not its name, that's its radio call sign. He is a brand new captain to this destroyer. He's on a destroyer, not a destroyer escort. And he's made the escort commander. Now that means he's in command of all the escort ships around the convoy. They wouldn't do that. You're not going to give a brand new guy command of 5 or 6 different escort ships in a situation he hasn't encountered yet. It is going to go to somebody who's made several crossings back and forth and has shown an ability to manage more than one ship. Fair enough. We've changed the story a little bit. I won't spoil the movie for you. During the course of the movie, Greyhound, either directly or with assistance, manages to sink 4 U-boats. That's very, very unusual. He's Tom Hanks. Give the poor guy a break. I'll accept that, even though the number of times that happens is definitely in the less than one hand time. It's a good movie. I enjoy it. It's an interesting movie because there's only one woman actress in the whole movie, since most of it's set on board the ship. But what did you think of it?
Oh, I loved it, but like you say, there's a lot of things that's like, I don't know, that's over the top. Especially when you did, the taunting and stuff over the radio.
Yeah, that was a radio system called TBS, which is a line of sight radio where the ships can talk back and forth the way Tom Hanks does. And the Germans couldn't find that frequency and listen in whether or not they were talking to you. You know, if I tell you I found your frequency, why am I doing that? Why don't I just listen to your conversations and not tell you? So I agree with you, that was silly. But we had to make the Germans bad. You know? Now, to be fair to the Germans, as the war progressed, the people in the submarine service going into the U-boats kept on going out. And the odds got progressively worse for them to ever come back. And they knew that. They knew that was happening. It still went out. They were fighting for a cause which was absolutely unsupportable, but in terms of individual bravery, they were very brave. Yeah.
How arc is the movie Das Boot?
I think Das Boot is a very good, accurate movie. I think that gets across a lot more of the boredom factor for naval service in World War II. That is for 80s, I think, late 80s. Centers around one particular U-boat focused on the captain. accurately shows the living conditions. I'll ask you to picture a small enclosed ship that has very poor ventilation, doesn't come up very often to change the air, has no refrigeration, so they take the food in port and they stuff it into all the crannies, and it's perpetually damp. Now, what happens to food when you put it in damp, uncirculated conditions? Well, that's still food you're going to eat because that's all there is. Not pleasant service. We're talking about shipboard life. Again, it's a movie. There are some things there that kind of push my boundaries a little bit, especially the ending. I think the ending is a little contrived. But in terms of looking at it to see what it was like to be in a U-boat, I think it's very accurate. Yeah.
My VFW post in Detroit, there was a guy who served on the USS Brooklyn during the Second World War with Lenny Bruce. Lenny Bruce was supposed to go to the Destroyer Escort section in the United States Navy when he enlisted. Rumor is he was supposed to go on the sleep, he was going to get a plank owner, but he got drunk, got into a fight, and wound up in the brig for 20 days and missed the movement. So that's how he wound up on the Brooklyn.
Okay.
I don't know if you look into that, but I got it from a veteran who served with him. And said he was just as insane then as he was until he took a flying leap off of that building.
Give us a good place to end this on Lenny Bruce. I think Lenny Bruce takes us to the next phase.
I don't know if you've ever heard anything like that.
No, I had never heard about that aspect of Lenny Bruce's life. As a person born in '54, I just know Lenny Bruce as the,
he was
crazy
actually,
counterculture comedian.
Yeah, he served on, and he was a combat veteran during the Second World War, that's right. The Anzio land.
Very strange things happened in World War II in the military. You could have almost anything wacky happen to you. And there was never anything personal about it. It was just the roll of the dice. But I can see if you missed your ship, then they would pissed off and say, well, you know what, we're going to send you someplace worse.
Well, actually, no. The bigger the ships in the service, I was on sea duty when I was in the Marine Corps. The bigger the ship, the better the conditions.
Well, and that's true.
Tin can sailors, that's almost a punishment.
You make a much bigger target.
True.
You can't fail to be aware that, given the choice between shooting at a destroyer escort and shooting at a cruiser, the enemy's going to take the cruiser.
Yeah, it's true, but ice cream machine,
Come throw me out if you want to do that.
Charles, thank you so much.
My pleasure. Thank you guys.